The bright morning sun streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 7A at the Franklin County Courthouse. Judge William Harrison, a 58-year-old white man with gray temples and wire-rimmed glasses, sat ramrod straight in his high-backed leather chair. His reputation for punctuality and strict courtroom management was well known throughout the legal community. Identified at exactly 8:55 a.m. He smoothed his black robes and nodded to his clerk Sarah to start checking the day's schedule. The large wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened steadily as people streamed in for the 9 a.m. session. Lawyers, in crisp suits and carrying briefcases, while court reporters and assistants made their own hurry to their respective positions. Judge Harrison watched them, all with his usually stern expression, checking his time every few minutes as exactly 9 a.m. He pounded his gavel onto the sound block. "Court is now in session," he said in his low, gray voice. The buzzing courtroom instantly quieted down. Today was significant. A high-profile medical malpractice case was to commence, and a jury had been painlessly selected over the past week. Just as Judge Harrison was beginning to make his opening comments, the large courtroom doors suddenly groaned open. A black woman, in her early 40s, hastened in, trying not to make too much noise, although her heels were clicking on the marble floor. She was in a navy blue suit carrying a leather messenger bag, her natural hair styled neatly in a professional manner. Small droplets of sweat dotted her forehead, and she was obviously out of breath. Judge Harrison's face darkened with annoyance as he despised tardiness more than anything else in his courtroom. Without hesitation, he struck his gavel again. The sharp sound echoed through the now silent room. "Ma'am," he called out sternly, "approach the bench immediately." The woman stopped in her tracks, slightly surprised before gathering herself, and walking to the front of the courtroom, her head held high despite the uncomfortable attention from everyone present. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" Judge Harrison asked, his voice dripping with disapproval. He didn't wait for her response before continuing. "This is a court of law, not a coffee shop where you can stroll in whenever you please." The woman opened her mouth to speak, but Judge Harrison raised his hand to silence her. "Your disrespect for this court and everyone present here is unacceptable." "What's your name?" "Dr. Michelle Thompson," she answered calmly, with clearly an exasperation in her eyes. "Well, Dr. Thompson," Judge Harrison said in a voice thick with irony, "being a medical professional does not protect you from the common practice of a courtroom. This is not a hospital where you get to set your own schedule." A couple of them present in the courtroom looked around uncomfortably, shifting in their chairs as tension filled the air, watching the scene unfold. "Your Honor, if I could just explain," Dr. Thompson tried, but again Judge Harrison cut her off. "I've heard every excuse in the book over my 25 years on this bench," he announced. "I'm fining you $500 for contempt of court. Maybe that will teach you the value of punctuality and respect for our system of justice." Dr. Thompson's face didn't change expression, but her hands instinctively tightened around the strap of her handbag. The courtroom was silent, except for the thick wool clock tick-tick-ticking in the background. Then Sarah, the court clerk, sprang from her chair, pale-faced with shaking hands, and hurriedly walked to the judge's bench. She hunched over the judge and leaned in close to Judge Harrison's ear and whispered something urgently. The change in Judge Harrison's expression was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from his face, and the stern composure he generally wore cracked visibly. His eyes widened behind his glasses, and his mouth parted slightly in shock. Dr. Michelle Thompson wasn't just some person who strolled into his courtroom late. She was the hand-picked forewoman for today's medical malpractice case, a highly regarded neurosurgeon who had been selected particularly for her expertise and judgment. The morning had started off normally enough, but within 15 minutes, Judge William Harrison had made a mistake that would shake his whole worldview, making him confront his own biases. The silence of the courtroom was heavy and seemed to go on forever as everyone in the courtroom waited to see what would happen next. Judge Harrison grasped the edge of his bench as Sarah, the court clerk, continued whispering in his ear. Not only was Dr. Thompson the forewoman of the jury, but the reason for her tardiness made the situation even worse. "Your Honor," Sarah whispered softly. Though her voice shook slightly, Dr. Thompson was late because she was administering urgency CPR to an old man who collapsed on the steps of the courthouse. The paramedics had just now arrived to take him to the hospital. The silence in the court was getting even thicker when Judge Harrison's face went from pale to dark crimson. He looked once again at Dr. Thompson, and for the first time the slight dishevelment of her otherwise impeccable appearance. The scuff marks on knees that had just been on concrete, her jacket somewhat wrinkled, and the residue of medical powder on her hands from the emergency gloves she must have used. Several members of the jury who had been seated quietly began whispering amongst each other. They had spent the last week getting to know Dr. Thompson during jury selection and knew about her impressive medical background. Several of them began to shake their heads in disapproval at the judge's hasty actions. Dr. Thompson stood patiently at the bench, her dignity intact despite the humiliating situation she had just endured. She pulled out her phone and showed it to Sarah. There were 3 missed calls from emergency services confirming her story, and a text message from the paramedics thanking her for her quick action. Judge Harrison cleared his throat a number of times before his voice finally broke through. Dr. Thompson, he began, the tone of his voice completely different from that of minutes before. I believe there has been a great misunderstanding. Yes, Your Honor, it was a great misunderstanding, Dr. Thompson replied calmly. She sounded steady and professional, but the challenge in her eyes made the judge wriggle uncomfortably in his seat. Would you like me to explain why I was delayed, or would you prefer to make more assumptions about my character and profession? A few jests echoed through the courtroom at her bull response. Defense attorney James Martinez quickly hid a smile behind his hand, while the prosecuting attorney looked nervously between the judge and the jury. For woman, Judge Harrison's clerk hurriedly brought him a glass of water, which he gulped down before speaking again. The court, he paused, removing his glasses and wiping them with a handkerchief. The court withdraws the contempt charge and the fine. Dr. Thompson, please accept my abject apologies for my premature assessment. But Dr. Thompson wasn't done with the same composed expertise she had exuded in her surgical suite. She said to the judge, Your Honor, though I appreciate your apology, I must tell you that your response exposes a disturbing trend. When you saw me walk into this courtroom, you jumped to conclusions about who I was and what I was doing you didn't request. An explanation. You didn't think that maybe I might have a valid reason for being late. You didn't even verify my role in today's proceedings. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was palpable. Everyone in that room knew they were seeing something big take place. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenograph, capturing every word of the exchange. Judge Harrison's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his mistake visible in his posture. You are absolutely right, Dr. Thompson. My behavior was inappropriate and unprofessional. I failed to uphold the very standards of justice and fairness that this court represents. Dr. Thompson nodded once, acknowledging his words. Then perhaps, Your Honor, we can proceed with today's case. I believe we have important matters to address, and I know everyone's time is valuable. The judge nodded, visibly relieved to return to familiar territory. Yes, of course. Please take your seat with the jury, Dr. Thompson. And again, my sincere apologies for the delay and my misconduct. As Dr. Thompson walked to the jury box, her fellow jurors made space with her out of obvious respect. A young law student in the gallery quickly wiped away tears, so moved by the dignity with which Dr. Thompson had handled the situation. Judge Harrison watched her take her seat, his usual confidence shaken to its core. In just 15 minutes, his whole worldview had been challenged, and he knew that this morning was going to change how he approached his duties from this day forward. As he prepared to begin the day's proceedings, he couldn't help but wonder how many other times his snap judgments might have affected the course of justice in his courtroom during morning recess. The courthouse hummed with whispers of the dramatic occurrences in courtroom 7A. Around the coffee machine and in hallway corners, more information concerning Dr. Michelle Thompson's background came to the surface. Sarah, the court clerk, relayed what she had learned during jury selection to her coworker Jenny. Dr. Thompson isn't just any doctor, she said, stirring her coffee. She is one of the neurosurgeons at Memorial Hospital. You know, she was the first black woman to head the surgery department. Sat quietly in the jury room reviewing her notes about the medical malpractice case before them. Her fellow jurors treated her with a mixture of respect and awe, especially after witnessing her handling of the morning's incident. Mark Peterson, a high school teacher serving on the jury, finally worked up the courage to ask about the emergency outside the courthouse. The elderly man is stable now, Dr. Thompson explained, her voice warm but professional. His grandson called to thank me, apparently Mr. Chen had forgotten to take his heart medication this morning. She didn't mention that she had already arranged with the hospital to check on Mr. Chun during her lunch break. Meanwhile, in his private chambers, Judge Harrison was having an uncomfortable conversation with his longtime friend and mentor, retired Judge Robert Maxwell. The older judge had heard about the morning's events and came to offer his perspective. While Judge Maxwell said, using the younger judge's first name, "I've known you for 20 years. You've always prided yourself on being fair and impartial. What happened this morning?" Judge Harrison stared out his office window, watching people come and go from the courthouse. "I made a terrible mistake, Bob, when I saw her rushing late. He paused, struggling to find the right words. I made assumptions I had no right to make." "Do you know why Dr. Thompson was selected as jury forewoman?" Judge Maxwell asked, pulling out a folder brought with him. He opened it to reveal newspaper clippings and medical journal articles. As Judge Harrison read through the materials, his face showed growing dismay. Dr. Michelle Thompson had done pioneering work on traumatic brain injuries. She had started a free medical clinic in a deprived neighborhood. She volunteered on a regular basis to teach emergency medical technicians in advanced life-saving techniques, which is why she had been so quick to Mr. Chen's aid that morning. She sits on 3 separate medical review boards, Judge Maxwell continued. Her expertise is precisely why both legal teams consented her serving this malpractice case jury. She's known for her careful attention to detail and absolute fairness in evaluating medical procedures. In the courthouse cafeteria, 2 young law interns discussed the morning's events while eating their sandwiches. "My professor would have loved to see this one. Said it's like a real-life lesson in implicit bias and judicial conduct." The other intern nodded. "Did you see how Dr. Thompson handled it?" "No. Shouting, no drama, just pure professionalism. That's power right there." Back in the jury room, Dr. Thompson, she had been given another update about Mr. Chen's condition. As she read the text message, her mind flashed back to that morning. How she had been running early for court, how she had witnessed the elderly man collapse. There had been no question in her mind then that stopping to help wasn't an option. It was who she was, both as a doctor and as a human being. Those thoughts were interrupted by a court officer bringing in lunch orders. As she took her salad, she saw that a handwritten note was attached to the container. It was from the courthouse security team, a thank you note for her. Quick that morning, they had seen the security footage as it played in the courtroom, showing her running to aid Mr. Chun without fumbling moments, directing onlookers and performing CPR until the paramedics arrived. A fellow juror grasped her arm, a gray-haired woman named Martha. "My husband had a heart attack last year," she whispered. "Someone like you saved his life by doing CPR. I just hope Judge Harrison realizes what kind of person he tried to find today." Dr. Thompson smiled softly at Martha and turned her attention to the task at hand. The case of malpractice that they were about to hear was complex, and she knew her medical expertise would be important in coming out with a just verdict. Despite the morning events, she was determined to carry out her duty as jury forewoman with the same passion and dedication that she brought into her medical practice. As the lunch break drew to an end, both Dr. Thompson and Judge Harrison prepared to return to the courtroom, each knowing that this afternoon session would be very different from that uncomfortable morning. The afternoon the session was all set to begin, but Judge William Harrison was feeling unusually nervous in his chambers. He continued to readjust his black robes and checked his reflection in the window, a habit for the very first time in his 25-year career. He instructed his clerk, Sarah, to delay the start of court by 15 minutes. He needed to do something at precisely 1:45 p.m. He walked confidently towards the jury room where Dr. Thompson studied case notes. The rest of the jurors stood up as he entered immediately, but his eyes went directly to the jury foreman. "Thompson, may I speak with you privately?" For a moment, Thompson glanced up from her papers, her expression neutral. "Of course, Your Honor," she said as she followed him to a small conference room nearby. The silence between the two of them hung thick as Judge Harrison closed the door. "Thompson," he began, but for once, his voice held no sense of authority. "I owe you more than the brief apology I gave this morning." He gestured for her to take a seat, but she politely declined, preferring to stand. "I spent my lunch break reading about your work," he continued, "your contributions to medical science, your free clinic, your teaching at the medical school. I was ashamed to learn that just last month you received the city's humanitarian award for your work with underprivileged communities." Dr. Thumps watched him carefully, her hands clasped in front of her. "Your Honor, I don't need you to list my accomplishments. What I needed this morning was basic respect, the same respect you'd grant any person coming into your courtroom." The judge's shoulders sagged slightly. "You're right. When you came in, I saw what I expected to see, what my biases led me to see. I didn't see Dr. Michelle Thompson, accomplished neurosurgeon and civic leader. I didn't even see a prospective juror. I saw a black woman whom you assumed didn't belong in my courtroom." Dr. Thompson completed her sentence. Her voice wasn't angry, but it was weighted of endless similar experiences. Judge Harrison nodded slowly, "Yes, and that's inexcusable, especially from someone in my position. I am supposed to represent justice, but this morning I represented prejudice." Inside the conference room, the court staff tried to look busy while stealing glances at the closed door. Everybody knew this conversation might lead to severe consequences for Judge Harrison's career if Dr. Thompson chose to file a formal complaint. Inside, Dr. Thompson moved to the window, looked out at the city below. Your Honor, every day I walk into my hospital, still people assume that I'm a nurse or an aide. Last week, a family demanded to see the real doctor. And all that when I was standing there in my surgical scrubs and my name and title blazoned on. The judge listened silently, her eyes knowing that this was something important she had been saying. "But I don't have the luxury of letting those assumptions make me angry. When I'm holding someone's life in my hands during surgery, I need to stay focused. When I'm evaluating a medical malpractice case as a jury for woman, I need to stay objective." Judge Harrison walked to stand beside her at the window. "How do you do it? How do you maintain such professionalism in the face of this?" Dr. Thompson turned to face him. "Because every time I prove someone's assumptions wrong, I make it a little easier for the next person who looks like me. Every time I excel despite the prejudice I create a crack in someone's biased worldview." The judge nodded thoughtfully like, "You did with me this morning." "Exactly," she replied. "Now, Your Honor, we have a medical malpractice case. Waiting, shall we return to the courtroom and proceed with the real reason we're both here today?" As they woke back together, Judge Harrison realized that this conversation had changed him more than any judicial training session ever had he watched Dr. Thompson return to her seat in the jury box, carrying herself with the same dignity she had shown all day. The afternoon session was about to begin, but now there was a different energy in courtroom 7A. The judge's gavel sounded softer somehow, and when he said "Court is now in session," his voice carried a new note of humility that his regular courtroom visitors had never heard before. The medical malpractice trial moved forward with Dr. Michelle Thompson proving exactly why she had been chosen as jury for woman. During the afternoon session, her presence in the courtroom became impossible to ignore, and not for the reasons of the morning's incident. As medical experts took the stand, Dr. Thompson's careful attention to detail became obvious to everyone present. She sat perfectly straight and took detailed notes in a small leather-bound notebook as the jury was allowed to submit questions for witnesses. Hers were always precise and thoughtful. This was the case of a young mother who had complications arise during a routine surgery. Dr. James Miller, the defendant surgeon, was currently on the witness stand explaining his actions during the operation. His confidence would seem to falter as he looked across to where Dr. Thompson might be, maybe hoping her expertise wouldn't catch any reason behind an attempt to downplay his decisions. "Could you explain your choice of surgical approach?" the defense attorney asked Dr. Miller. As the surgeon launched into a complicated medical explanation, Judge Harrison noticed something interesting. Dr. Thompson was writing rapidly in her notebook, her medical knowledge allowing her to catch details that others might miss. Several times, she looked up sharply when Dr. Miller used technical terms or expressions suggesting she had caught something significant during one particularly technical explanation. Judge Harrison saw Dr. Thompson shook her head. Not much, but enough. It spoke volumes, because the judge found himself immediately wondering what her trained medical eye was seeing that others weren't. He knew from experience that the other jurors in most trials looked to Dr. Thompson for subtle cues when things were confusing and used a lot of medical terminology. She'd often write down plain explanations and pass them to her fellow jurors to explain some of the more complex medical testimony, discreetly enough not to influence their opinions, but only to describe technical points. In the afternoon break, Sarah, the court clerk, overheard two lawyers discussing the case in the hallway. Having Dr. Thompson on that jury is like having a human lie detector for medical testimony, one lawyer whispered. Did you see how the defendant started sweating when she raised her eyebrow during his explanation of the surgical complications? The other lawyer nodded. I heard she's written 3 papers on exactly this type of procedure. The defense team must be nervous back at the courtroom. The plaintiff's attorney called another expert witness, Dr. Sarah Chun, a surgical specialist from a neighboring state. As Dr. Chun took to the witness stand to begin her testimony, the responses she gave were as if written solely to Dr. Thompson, a fellow medical professional who she knew would grasp the fine details behind her explanation. Judge Harrison found himself observing Dr. Thompson way more than usual. Her presence had changed from being the source of his morning embarrassment to an important reminder of white diversity within the courtroom so crucial. Her expertise wasn't about assisting the jury in understanding medical facts. It was about making sure true medical understanding and not by confused interpretations. In one complex medical explanation, young Michael, a juror, looked completely lost. Dr. Thompson quietly drew a simple diagram on her notepad about the surgical procedure being discussed and passed it on to Michael. His face really lit up with understanding. Judge Harrison noticed the small act of kindness and leadership. He felt another wave of shame about his morning behavior. Late in the afternoon, Dr. Miller was describing a critical moment during the surgery. His voice faltered slightly as he noticed Dr. Thompson leaning forward, her attention completely focused on his words. She wrote something in her notebook and underlined it twice. The defense attorney, noticing his client's discomfort, tried to redirect the testimony towards simpler terms, but Dr. Thompson raised her hand politely, and Judge Harrison nodded for her to speak. Your Honor, could you ask the witness to clarify the exact time sequence of events during the complications? Her question was precise and professional, but it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that much importance hung in the balance. Dr. Miller's face lightened a little as he realized he would have to be more precise about just what he did during those crucial moments. The timeline he now painted was decidedly different from his earlier testimony. As the day's session drew to a close, Judge Harrison couldn't help but think about how differently things might have gone if he had succeeded in removing Dr. Thompson from the jury with his morning fine. She wasn't just important to this case, it was necessary for justice. The sun was setting outside the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom. But inside, Dr. Thompson's quiet competence continued to shine, illuminating the truth in ways no one else could. The second day of the trial started very unlike the first. Judge Harrison came to his chambers an hour early, thing he never does. He sat at his desk reviewing not the case files, but rather his own past court records. His conversation with Dr. Thompson the previous day had sparked something in him that wouldn't let go. As he flipped through old cases, he began to notice patterns in his previous judgments and behavior that made him increasingly uncomfortable. How many times had he made quick decisions based on first impressions? How many times had his assumptions affected the course of justice in his courtroom? Sarah, his clerk, knocked softly on his door with his morning coffee. She found him surrounded by stacks of old case files, his reading glasses perched on his nose. Looking pleased, Your Honor, she said softly. Dr. Thompson has already arrived. She's attending to Mr. Chin, the gentleman she assisted yesterday. He's here for another court matter. Through his chamber window, Judge Harrison saw Dr. Thompson standing in the courthouse lobby. She was taking Mr. Chin's blood pressure and explaining to his grandson how to better assist him with his medication. Several courthouse security officers were standing nearby, looking on in admiration at how she was taking the time to write out clear instructions in both English and Chinese. The scene struck him hard to believe it. He had every reason to be angry about yesterday's treatment, yet she was commencing her day helping others. The contrast in what she was doing versus his previous day behavior couldn't be any stronger. Other jurors were arriving in the jury room. Their interaction with Dr. Thompson had changed because now they treated her with this new level of respect, not just for her expertise in the medical field, but because of how she handled the judge's prejudice with such dignity. Dr. Thompson, Martha, the elderly juror, as I drew closer to her, I related to my husband what transpired yesterday. He remarked, "We need more people like you in positions of power." Dr. Thompson smiled warmly, but turned the discussion back to the case at hand. The most important thing right now is making sure we give this case the attention it deserves. Every patient deserves quality care, and every medical professional must be held accountable for their actions. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison was to see an unexpected visitor. Judge Robert Maxwell had returned this time with news that made Harrison's stomach turn. Well, Maxwell said, seriously, the local news has gotten wind of yesterday's incident. They're running a story about racial bias in the justice system, using what happened with Dr. Thompson as their latest example. Harrison sank into his chair. They have every right to report it. He said quietly, what I did was wrong, and maybe this will help other judges examine their own biases. That's surprisingly humble of you, Will. Maxwell observed what change Harrison stood and walked to his window again, watching as Dr. Thompson made her on my way toward the courtroom yesterday. I saw real leadership, Bob. Not the kind which comes from a position or a title, but that which comes from character. Dr. Thompson could have filed a complaint. She could have demanded I recuse myself. Instead, she showed me what true professionalism looks like. As the courtroom began to fill for the day's proceedings, Harrison noticed something else. The gallery was more crowded than usual. Word had spread about Dr. Thompson's presence on the jury, and several young black law students had come to watch the trial. They sat in the back, their eyes filled with hope and determination as they watched Dr. Thompson take her place in the jury box. Before beginning the session, Judge Harrison did something quite unexpected. Before we begin, I want to make something known. Yesterday morning, I made a grave error in judgment that reflected my very own biases. Although I have apologized privately to the person IED, I believe it's necessary to say publicly that such conduct is unacceptable in this courtroom or any courtroom. The gallery was silent, but several of them nodded in approval. Dr. Thompson did not bat an eyelid, but her eyes briefly met those of the judges, acknowledging how valuable his public statement had been. As the trial recommenced, Judge Harrison found that he was conducting his courtroom differently. He listened harder, spoke more judiciously, and most importantly caught himself every time he could feel a snap judgment forming in his mind. The lesson Dr. Thompson had taught him was already changing how he conducted his sacred duty to justice. The medical malpractice trial was by day 3. In courtroom 7, the tension was reaching its final stages as both legal teams prepared for their closing arguments. But all eyes were on Dr. Michelle Thompson, who took the lead with quiet authority before the jury in the defense's final presentation. Then, the moment of moments arrived. The defense attorney was going through slides of the surgical procedure, attempting to prove his client did what any other doctor did while performing that standard practice. Dr. Thompson suddenly raised her hand, something she rarely did without careful consideration. "Your Honor," she said in a loud, clear voice. "I believe there is a major discrepancy in the surgical times being presented." Judge Harrison nodded that she could continue. The entire courtroom hushed with silence. These medical records show this patient had a drop in blood pressure at 9:45 a.m., but the surgical log shows that the emergency response did not start until 10:30 a.m. That's a 45-minute gap that has yet to be explained. The defense attorney fumbled through his paper ERS while Dr. Miller, the defendant surgeon, noticeably whitened as this one detail, somehow overlooked by both legal teams, had not escaped Dr. Thompson's eye, which was at least trained for such. The plaintiff, Mrs. Garcia, was a young mother injured in that surgery and started to softly cry in her seat. Her husband clasped her hand tightly, realizing perhaps this observation could very well be their key. Judge Harrison watched as Dr. Thompson's simplistic observation unraveled. Defenses constructed in record time. He could not help but reflect on how his prejudice may have blocked this moment of truth from taking place in jury deliberation. Dr. Thompson's medical expertise became quite instrumental in the jury room as she clearly explained to her fellow jurors the importance of the time gap. In a surgery like this, she explained in basic terms, every minute counts. A 45-minute delay in responding to dropping blood pressure is not just concern-earning. It's potentially negligent. Martha, the elderly juror, spoke up, but Dr. Miller seemed so confident when he explained his actions. Dr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. Confidence does not always equate with competence. As medical professionals, our first duty is to our patient's safety, not to protecting our egos. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury reached their decision. As they filed back into the courtroom, Judge Harrison noticed how the other jurors had naturally formed a protective circle around Dr. Thompson. Understanding the weight of responsibility on her shoulders as there from the courtroom, was packed. News of Dr. Thompson's crucial observation had spread, and many local doctors and medical students had come to witness the verdict. Among them sat Mr. Chin, the elderly man whose life Dr. Thompson had saved just 2 days ago. Standing tall, Dr. Thompson, prepared to deliver the verdict, her voice was clear and unwavering as she spoke. In the case of Garcia versus Dr. Miller, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of medical negligence. She then did something unexpected. Rather than she sat down, continuing to speak, as she had asked and been granted permission by Judge Harrison to explain the jury's reasoning. Our verdict was not taken lightly, she said. We weighed all evidence provided. The 45-minute delay in response to the patient's dropping blood pressure was a severe digression of accepted medical practice. As physicians, we have a sacred trust with our patients. If we breach that duty, we must be responsible. Judge Harrison watched as Dr. Miller lowered his head to acknowledge the truth in her words. The plaintiff's family clung to each other, unashamedly coursing rivulets of release. As Dr. Thompson concluded her statements, something quite miraculous happened. The medical students in the gallery rose to their feet in silent homage, not only to her verdict, but also to her personification of both medical and moral integrity. The courthouse reporter that it covered a long stream of thousands of cases would later write that she had never seen a verdict given with such precision, compassion, and authority. After the verdict was recorded, Judge Harrison looked at Doctor. She had gone in with new eyes. In just 3 days, she had ensured justice was served, but taught him and everybody else in his courtroom some very valuable, important lessons on prejudice, professionalism, and what justice truly means. As the sun said good morning on the third day, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows, Dr. Thompson gathered her notes one last time. Her job as foreman of the jury was done, but her impact on Courtroom 7 would be quite a while longer. A month after the medical malpractice trial, the Franklin County Courthouse looked different. New signs hung in every courtroom. Justice sees no color, only truth. These weren't just empty words. They were a direct result of the changes Judge William Harrison had implemented following his encounter with Dr. Michelle Thompson. On this particular morning, the courthouse was unusually busy. The local bar association was holding its annual meeting in the main conference room. Judge Harrison stood at the podium facing a packed room of lawyers, judges, and legal professionals. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his microphone. A month ago, I made a mistake that changed my entire perspective on justice, he began. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment and almost prevented a highly qualified medical professional from serving as jury for Woman All because of the color of her skin. In the audience, Dr. Thompson sat quietly. She hadn't planned to attend, but Judge Harrison had personally called to invite her. She wore the same navy blue suit from that first morning, but this time there was no rush, no emergency CPR to perform. She listened carefully as the judge continued. Since that day, we've made changes in our courthouse, Harrison explained. We've instituted mandatory bias training for all court personnel. We've revised our jury selection procedures. We've created a new position, community justice advisor, and I'm proud to announce that Dr. Michelle Thompson has agreed to serve as our first advisor. Applause filled the room. The young law students who had witnessed the trial were now interns at the courthouse, and they clapped the loudest. They had already heard about Dr. Thompson's new role. She would help ensure that the system of justice served all members of their community. Mr. Chun, the elderly man whose life Dr. Thompson had saved, sat in the front row with his grandson. He had become a regular visitor to the courthouse, volunteering as a translator for other Chinese-speaking residents. His presence was a daily reminder of how one person's integrity could create ripples of positive change. Judge Harrison then shared something unexpected. Last week, I reversed 3 of my previous judgments after reviewing them for potential bias. It wasn't easy to admit I might have been wrong, but Dr. Thompson taught me that true justice requires constant self-examination. In the back of the room, Sarah, the court clerk, wiped away tears. She remembered that first morning, how terrified she had been to tell the judge he was wrong. Now she ran the courthouse's new cultural sensitivity training program. Afterwards, Dr. Thompson approached Judge Harrison. She carried a small package. "Your Honor," she said, "the medical board asked me to give you this." Inside was a plaque recognizing the courthouse's new initiatives for promoting equality in the justice system. "I don't deserve this," Harrison said quietly. "This isn't about what you did, Ron," Dr. Thompson replied. "It's about what you did to make it right." Later that afternoon, a young black girl on a school field trip stopped Dr. Thompson in the courthouse hallway. "Are you the doctor who became a jury leader?" she asked excitedly. "My mom told me about you. I want to be a doctor and a judge." Dr. Thompson knelt down. "To the girl's level, you can be anything you want to be," and don't let anyone's assumption stop you. Judge Harrison, who had watched from his chamber window, was smiling. More than 100 cases had been handled by the courthouse since the medical malpractice trial, each with a new consciousness and level of care brought to it. Later in the day, Dr. Thompson checked in on the new bias training session for incoming court officers. She walked by courtroom 7A, now referred to informally among the staff as the Thompson Court. Inside, a diverse pool of jurors was being sworn in for a new trial. Judge Harrison caught up with her in the lobby. Dr. Thompson called out, "I never asked, why did you accept the advisor position?" She turned to him with a warm smile. "Because change doesn't happen from the outside, Your Honor. It happens when people on the inside decide to be better." As they walked out of the courthouse together, the setting sun cast their shadows side by side down the steps, a judge and a doctor. So different, yet united in their commitment to justice. The courthouse's new motto gleamed above them: "Justice sees no color, only truth." And in that moment, both of them knew that what had started off as a mounting of prejudice was transformed into a legacy of good that would affect their community for generations to come.